Imagine sitting in a pew every Sunday for 20 years, faithfully following every instruction, reciting every prayer, attending every service, and still feeling that God is somehow distant, unreachable, just beyond your grasp. You did everything right, and yet something essential was always missing. That feeling has a reason, and its name is institutional dependency. Joel Goldsmith did not arrive at his discoveries by accident. He spent years inside traditional religious structures, observing what they produced in people's lives, and what he consistently witnessed was not spiritual freedom, it was spiritual paralysis. Sincere, devoted people who had learned to need the church more than they had learned to need God directly. This is not an attack on faith or on sincere believers. Most people in organized religion are genuinely seeking truth. The problem is not the seeking. The problem is the structure that surrounds the seeking, a structure quietly designed to keep the seeker always arriving, never arrived, always praying, never hearing, always asking, never knowing. What Goldsmith discovered changed everything. There is a dimension of spiritual life that no institution can give you, because it was never theirs to give. It already lives inside you, fully formed, waiting. And the moment you understand why the church could never hand it to you, your entire inner life begins to shift in ways that unfold gradually over weeks and months of sincere practice. Joel Goldsmith grew up surrounded by conventional religion, but even as a young man, he sensed that something fundamental was being left out of the conversation. The services were sincere, the hymns were moving, the prayers were earnest. But the results, real, lasting inner transformation, were rarely visible in the lives of long-term congregants. He began asking why. What he discovered was not a conspiracy. It was something more subtle and more pervasive than conspiracy. It was a structural assumption built into institutional religion from its earliest days. The assumption that human beings are separated from God and require a certified external system to bridge that gap. This assumption, Goldsmith realized, was the root of all spiritual weakness. When you believe you are separated from God, you become a spiritual beggar. You approach the divine with requests, with bargaining, with the anxious hope that perhaps this time your prayers will be heard. You measure your spiritual worth by whether your petitions are granted, and when they are not, as they often are not, you either blame yourself for insufficient faith or quietly lose hope altogether. Goldsmith called this the great spiritual tragedy of the modern age. Not that people lacked sincerity, but that their sincerity was being poured into a model of prayer and worship that reinforced the very separation it claimed to heal. Understanding this distinction is the first genuine step toward a different kind of inner life. There is a specific moment in many people's spiritual lives when the institutional model begins to crack. It rarely happens dramatically. More often it comes as a quiet, persistent question that the official answers no longer satisfy. You have prayed the approved prayers. You have followed the prescribed steps. And still, something inside you remains untouched, unchanged, unhealed. That question is not a sign of weakening faith. It is the first sign of awakening. Joel Goldsmith identified what he called the recognition of inner completeness as the turning point in genuine spiritual development. This is not a theological concept. It is a lived experience. The moment when a person stops relating to God as a distant authority to be appeased and begins recognizing the divine as an ever-present reality already dwelling within consciousness itself. This shift does not happen overnight. For most people, it unfolds gradually over months of sincere inner work. But once it begins, its effects are unmistakable. The anxious quality of prayer dissolves. The desperate bargaining softens. A quiet confidence begins to replace the spiritual poverty that institutional religion, unintentionally but consistently, had been reinforcing every single week. The church was never equipped to give you this, not because it lacked resources, but because its entire framework was built on the premise of your separation from God. Goldsmith's great gift was showing that this premise was always fundamentally untrue, and that truth, once touched, cannot be unfelt. Most people who grew up in traditional religious environments absorbed a specific and deeply limiting image of prayer. Prayer was asking. Prayer was requesting. Prayer was the act of approaching a powerful external God and presenting your needs with sufficient humility and sincerity to hopefully receive a favorable response. This model feels natural because it mirrors every other power relationship we know: the child asking the parent, the citizen petitioning the government. But Goldsmith identified something profound. This model of prayer, however sincere, actually deepens the spiritual wound it claims to heal. Every time you pray as a beggar before a distant God, you are rehearsing and reinforcing your own smallness. You are practicing separation. You are confirming, in the deepest language of consciousness, that you are not whole, not complete, not connected. The alternative Goldsmith taught is not a technique or a formula. It is a fundamental reorientation of identity. Instead of approaching God as an outside power, you begin the practice of recognizing God as the very life and intelligence expressing itself as you. This is not arrogance. It is the most honest theological position available, one confirmed by every genuine mystic across every genuine tradition. This shift takes practice. It requires weeks and months of quiet, consistent inner turning. But it begins with a single insight. The church kept you weak not out of malice, but because it never knew you were already whole. Now you are beginning to know it for yourself. Consider a man named Kenneth, who spent 31 years as a devoted member of his church. He served on committees, led Bible studies, volunteered every weekend. By every external measure, he was a model of religious dedication. But privately, Kenneth carried a weight that never lifted, a persistent sense of spiritual inadequacy, a feeling that no matter how much he gave, God remained somehow unimpressed, distant, and silent. The turning point came not during a service, but during an ordinary Tuesday morning when Kenneth, exhausted and quietly desperate, stopped praying in the usual way. He stopped asking. He stopped presenting his list of needs. Instead, he simply sat in silence and allowed himself to rest in the possibility that God was already present, not as a reward for sufficient effort, but as the very ground of his existence. That single shift began changing things. It was not instant. Over the following weeks, the anxiety that had colored his spiritual life for 3 decades began, gradually, to soften, not because his circumstances changed immediately, but because his relationship with the inner life began to transform. He stopped measuring his worth by what he received and began simply resting in what he was. That is what Goldsmith called practicing the presence, not as technique, but as homecoming. Kenneth later said the most disorienting part of this discovery was realizing the church had never taught him this was possible, not because the teachers were dishonest, but because they themselves had never been shown the way. The institutional blindness was sincere, and sincerely, it had cost him 30 years of unnecessary spiritual poverty. There was a woman named Carol, but not the Carol you might expect. This Carol was a seminary-trained minister who had dedicated her life to serving others spiritually. She knew Scripture deeply, counseled hundreds of congregants through grief and illness, and was universally regarded as a pillar of her community. And yet, in her most private moments, she felt like a hollow vessel, giving guidance she had never fully received herself. She encountered Goldsmith's writings during a period of personal crisis, when her own health declined, and the prayers she had prescribed to others brought her no comfort. What struck her most forcefully was his insistence that spiritual healing was not a matter of persuading God to act. It was a matter of recognizing that the power and wholeness of God were already present, and that illness, lack, and fear were conditions of a consciousness still living in the illusion of separation. This was not easy for her to accept. Her entire training had been built on the intermediary model, the idea that her role was to connect people to a God they could not reach alone. Dismantling that assumption required months of uncomfortable inner work. But as she persisted, something began to shift in her own body and in the quality of her inner life. The healing was gradual, unfolding over several months, but it was undeniable. She did not leave her ministry. She transformed it. She began teaching from the place Goldsmith described, not as a broker between humanity and God, but as a witness to the wholeness already present in every person who sat before her. Her congregation felt the difference immediately, even before they could name what had changed. There is a pattern that Goldsmith observed repeatedly across the lives of people who made this inner transition, and it is worth examining carefully because it dismantles one of the most persistent myths about spiritual growth. The myth is that genuine spiritual awakening produces instant and dramatic results, that the moment you shift your consciousness, your health restores overnight, your relationships transform in a week, your financial lack disappears within days. Goldsmith was honest about this in a way that most spiritual teachers of his era were not. Real transformation, he insisted, follows the same pattern as any genuine growth in nature. It moves in stages. It has seasons of apparent stillness where the deepest work is happening invisibly beneath the surface. The person who expects a single prayer or a single insight to resolve decades of conditioned separation will almost certainly be disappointed, and that disappointment will be used by the old patterns to pull them back into doubt. What actually happens for most people practicing these principles sincerely is a gradual but unmistakable lightening. Over weeks and months, the chronic anxiety begins to lose its grip. The compulsive need to petition and bargain in prayer begins to feel unnecessary. A quiet confidence begins to inhabit the spaces where fear once lived. These are not dramatic announcements. They are quiet revolutions, happening one breath at a time inside a consciousness, learning to trust its own wholeness. This gradual unfolding is not a sign that the practice is weak. It is evidence that the transformation is real, rooted in the deep soil of consciousness rather than in the shallow ground of emotional excitement. There is something that happens in the body when the soul stops begging. It is subtle at first, a slight release of tension in the shoulders, a breath that goes slightly deeper than usual, a moment of inexplicable quiet in the mind during what should have been an anxious hour. These are not dramatic signs, but they are real, and they are the first physical echoes of a consciousness beginning to remember its own completeness. Joel Goldsmith taught that spiritual and physical well-being are not separate domains governed by separate laws. They are expressions of a single underlying reality, consciousness. When consciousness shifts from the poverty of separation into the recognition of divine wholeness already present, the body begins gradually to reflect that shift. Not always quickly, not always in the ways we expect, but the movement is real and it is consistent. This is why the institutional model produces not only spiritual weakness, but often a kind of chronic low-grade suffering that its practitioners cannot fully explain. When you spend years training your deepest self to feel distant from its source, the body keeps that score. And when you begin the slow, sincere work of returning, of recognizing rather than petitioning, of resting rather than striving, the body begins, in its own time and its own way, to respond. You do not have to take this on faith alone. You only have to begin the practice of sitting quietly, releasing the posture of the beggar, and resting in the recognition that the life of God is the very life you are already living. If these transformation stories are opening something real in you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment below. What part of your spiritual journey resonated most deeply with you today? Beyond the foundational shift from petition to recognition, Goldsmith developed a set of complementary inner practices that deepen and sustain the transformation already begun. The first and perhaps most essential of these is what he called spiritual listening, a practice so simple in description and so demanding in application that most people initially underestimate its power entirely. Spiritual listening is not passive. It is not the absence of thought or the achievement of mental blankness. It is an active inner orientation, a turning of attention toward the deeper dimension of consciousness, where the activity of God moves continuously beneath the noise of worry, planning, and self-commentary. Goldsmith described it as learning to hear with an ear that has nothing to do with the physical sense of hearing. Most people, when they first attempt this practice, encounter only their own mental noise. The thoughts keep arriving. The to-do lists surface. The old anxieties reassert themselves. This is normal and expected. Goldsmith was clear that the capacity for genuine spiritual listening develops slowly, over weeks and months of patient, consistent practice. The first reward is not silence, but rather the growing ability to observe the mental noise without being fully captured by it. Over time, something deeper begins to emerge beneath that noise, a quality of inner stillness that carries its own unmistakable authority. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with visions or voices. It arrives as a kind of settled knowing, a quiet certainty that does not depend on external confirmation. That is the beginning of what Goldsmith called hearing the still, small voice. Alongside spiritual listening, Goldsmith taught the practice of impersonalization, a term that sounds cold, but carries one of the warmest and most liberating truths in his entire body of work. Impersonalization means learning to stop taking personally the negative conditions and difficult behaviors you encounter in life, including within yourself. It means recognizing that fear, illness, conflict, and limitation are not personal possessions or personal failures. They are impersonal claims appearing in consciousness. This distinction matters enormously in practice. When you believe your anxiety is yours, a personal defect, a sign of weak faith, a punishment for past failures, you reinforce it with every moment of self-judgment. You make it heavier by making it personal. Goldsmith's insight was that these conditions have no more personal ownership than a cloud passing through a sky. The sky does not become the cloud. Consciousness does not become its passing conditions. Practicing impersonalization does not mean denying that difficulties exist or pretending that pain is not felt. It means shifting the relationship with difficulty, learning to observe conditions without fully identifying with them. This shift alone, practiced consistently over weeks and months, begins to loosen the grip of chronic patterns that have seemed permanent and immovable for years. The practical entry point is simple, though not easy. When a difficult thought or feeling arises, instead of claiming it as yours, try simply noting its presence without ownership. Not my fear, not my illness, not my failure. Just a condition arising in consciousness, without a permanent address, and without the power to define what you fundamentally are. The companion practice to impersonalization is what Goldsmith called nothingization, the recognition that the negative conditions arising in human experience have no genuine spiritual substance, no power rooted in ultimate reality, and no ability to maintain themselves in the presence of a consciousness resting in divine truth. This is perhaps the most radical of all his practical teachings, and it requires careful understanding to avoid misapplication. Nothingization does not mean dismissing pain or pretending that a difficult condition does not appear to exist in the human experience. Goldsmith was precise about this. The appearance is real as an appearance. The suffering is genuinely felt. What nothingization addresses is the deeper question of whether the condition has ultimate authority, whether it represents a final truth about reality, or merely a disturbance in the field of a consciousness not yet fully awake to its own wholeness. Think of it this way. When you wake from a nightmare, the fear you felt during the dream was completely real as an experience, but the moment of waking reveals that the threatening reality of the dream had no genuine substance. It was a convincing appearance with no ultimate power. Nothingization is the practice of cultivating that waking moment, not by force, but by gently, persistently returning consciousness to the recognition of the wholeness that underlies every appearance. This practice is best approached in small steps. Begin with minor irritations or mild anxieties before attempting to apply it to major challenges. Build the inner muscle gradually. Consistent daily practice over several months produces a quality of inner stability that the most earnest petition-based prayer rarely achieves. There is a question that arises naturally at this point in the exploration of Goldsmith's teachings, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a spiritually polished deflection. The question is this: if these principles are true, why do so many sincere and devoted practitioners still experience illness, loss, and prolonged suffering? Why does the shift in consciousness not produce more visible and consistent results across more lives? Goldsmith himself addressed this question with characteristic honesty. He acknowledged that the principles he taught were not magic switches that, once activated, instantly resolved all human difficulty. They were, instead, a new way of being in relationship with reality, one that required sustained practice, genuine patience, and a willingness to persist through periods of apparent non-response that would challenge even the most committed practitioner. The honest answer is that consciousness transformation is deep work. It operates at a level beneath the surface of conscious intention, reshaping patterns that were laid down over years and decades of conditioned thinking. Results in the outer life often lag significantly behind the inner shifts, sometimes by months. This is not a flaw in the teaching. It is the nature of genuine transformation as opposed to temporary emotional relief. What Goldsmith's approach consistently produces, even before outer circumstances shift, is a fundamental change in the quality of inner experience. The chronic suffering of spiritual poverty, the ache of felt separation from God, begins to ease. And that easing, quiet as it is, represents the most significant healing available to any human being. Every person who sincerely begins the inner work that Goldsmith describes will, at some point, encounter the first and most common obstacle, the return of the old prayer habit. You have spent perhaps years or decades practicing petition-based prayer. It is deeply grooved into your spiritual reflexes. And when a genuine crisis arrives, A medical diagnosis, a relationship rupturing, a financial collapse, every carefully cultivated new understanding tends to temporarily evaporate, replaced by the urgent, anxious cry of the old consciousness, asking God to please fix this now. Goldsmith did not shame people for this return. He expected it and prepared his students for it with unusual tenderness. He understood that the grooves of conditioned response are not erased by a single insight, however genuine. They are worn smooth gradually, through patient repetition of the new inner orientation. The return to old patterns in moments of crisis is not a sign of failure. It is simply evidence that the new pattern has not yet been practiced long enough to become the instinctive response. The practical guidance he offered for this obstacle was precise and compassionate. When you notice yourself sliding back into petition, when you hear yourself bargaining with God in the old way, do not resist it forcefully or judge yourself harshly. Simply notice the return, acknowledge it without drama, and gently redirect attention back toward recognition, back toward the knowing that the presence and power you are begging for is already the very life you are living. This gentle redirection, repeated without self-condemnation over weeks and months of practice, is what eventually rewires the spiritual reflex. The crisis still comes, but gradually the first response begins to shift from desperate asking to quiet recognition. The second major obstacle that Goldsmith identified is one that is rarely discussed openly in spiritual communities because it is uncomfortable to name: the obstacle of spiritual pride. This is the subtle but powerful tendency, once a person has begun experiencing genuine inner shifts, to begin measuring their spiritual progress and comparing it, consciously or unconsciously, with the apparent lack of progress in others around them. This is a particularly insidious obstacle because it arrives wearing the clothes of genuine growth. You have made real progress. Your inner life has genuinely shifted. The anxious quality of your old prayer practice has softened, and in that opening, the ego, which has been temporarily displaced but not permanently dissolved, finds a new strategy. It begins to re-establish itself as a spiritually advanced ego, subtly superior to those still trapped in the institutional model you have moved beyond. Goldsmith warned repeatedly that this re-entry of ego through the door of spiritual accomplishment was one of the most reliable ways that genuine progress was arrested and reversed. The moment you begin congratulating yourself on having transcended the weakness of institutional religion, you have, in that very moment, recreated a new form of the same separation you were escaping. Now you are separated not from God, but from your fellow human beings, which amounts to the same spiritual error in different clothing. The antidote is consistent humility, not performed humility, but the genuine recognition that the wholeness you are beginning to experience was never your achievement. It was always already present. You only removed some of the obstructions to seeing it. That recognition keeps the door of genuine growth open. The third obstacle is perhaps the most practically challenging, because it strikes not at pride or habit, but at the foundational commitment required to sustain genuine inner work over time. It is the obstacle of inconsistency, the gradual erosion of daily practice under the ordinary pressures of a busy life. Weeks pass. The morning silence gets replaced by an early meeting. The evening contemplation gives way to exhaustion, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the inner work that was producing real results begins to thin out. Goldsmith was unambiguous about the necessity of consistent practice. He did not teach that occasional inspiration was sufficient to sustain genuine transformation. He taught that the new consciousness, the recognition of wholeness, the practice of listening, the discipline of impersonalization, required regular, dedicated cultivation, much as a garden requires regular tending to remain productive, rather than reverting to its wild and uncultivated state. The practical guidance here is not about perfection, but about honest recommitment. Missing a day of practice is not a spiritual catastrophe. Allowing days to become weeks of disconnection is where the real cost accumulates. Goldsmith suggested treating the daily inner practice with the same non-negotiable quality that one might give to eating or sleeping, not as an optional enhancement for particularly spiritual days, but as the basic maintenance of the most important dimension of human life. If you have allowed your practice to thin, the path back is not complicated. You simply return, without excessive self-reproach, to the quiet sitting, the listening, the recognition. The inner life is extraordinarily forgiving of interruptions. It asks only that you come back. There is a fourth obstacle that Goldsmith addressed with particular care: the challenge of practicing these principles inside a social and family environment that does not share them and may actively resist them. Most people who discover Goldsmith's teachings do not live in spiritual monasteries. They live with partners, children, colleagues, and friends who were shaped by the same institutional religious model, and who may experience the practitioner's inner shift as threatening, eccentric, or simply incomprehensible. This social friction is real, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. When you stop participating in communal petition prayer with the old urgency, people notice. When you respond to a family health crisis with quiet recognition rather than anxious intercession, it can look like indifference to those who do not understand the inner movement behind it. When you decline to validate the drama of spiritual emergency that the old model constantly generated, relationships can become strained. Goldsmith's guidance on this was both practical and profound. He did not advocate for withdrawal from normal human relationships or for aggressive evangelism of the new understanding. He taught, instead, the practice of what he called holding to your own inner knowing without requiring external validation or agreement. You do not need others to understand your inner shift for it to be real. You do not need to convince anyone. Your only task is to maintain the integrity of your own inner life, regardless of the surrounding pressure. Over time, something interesting tends to happen in these relationships. As your inner life stabilizes and the quality of your presence changes, the people around you begin to feel something different in you, even without understanding what it is. The shift becomes its own quiet testimony. If these obstacle-breaking insights are speaking to something real in your experience, like this video to support this work, subscribe for advanced teachings, and comment. Which of these obstacles are you most ready to move through right now? Having moved through the foundational shift and the common obstacles, a more advanced question emerges for the sincere practitioner. How do these principles integrate into the specific and demanding challenges of daily life? Not the theoretical daily life of spiritual literature, but the actual daily life of deadlines, difficult relationships, financial pressure, health concerns, and the 1,000 ordinary stresses that constitute the texture of modern existence. Goldsmith was not a teacher who retreated from this question into abstraction. He insisted that a spiritual understanding that could not function in the middle of ordinary life was not a genuine spiritual understanding. It was merely a pleasant mood that required ideal conditions to maintain itself. Real inner freedom, he taught, must be capable of expressing itself precisely when conditions are most unfavorable, in the difficult conversation, in the frightening diagnosis, in the moment when every external signal suggests that panic is the only reasonable response. The advanced integration he described begins with what might be called the practice of inner maintenance, the cultivation of a background awareness of divine presence that does not require withdrawal from activity in order to function. This is not the same as the deep morning silence of formal practice. It is a subtler thread of recognition, woven through the ordinary movements of the day, a quality of inner listening that continues even while the hands and mind are occupied with practical tasks. Building this capacity takes considerably longer than establishing the basic morning practice. For most people, developing a reliable thread of inner awareness through active daily life requires a year or more of consistent foundational work. But it is entirely possible, and those who achieve it describe a quality of inner stability that no external circumstance can significantly disturb. One of the most practically significant applications of advanced Goldsmith practice involves the specific challenge of physical health, an area where the distance between spiritual principle and lived experience can feel painfully wide when genuine illness is present. Many practitioners encounter a particular form of inner conflict here. They understand intellectually that consciousness is primary and that physical conditions reflect deeper patterns of awareness, but they also live in bodies that hurt, that receive alarming diagnoses, that deteriorate in ways that make abstract spiritual reassurance feel almost cruel. Goldsmith addressed this tension with unusual honesty. He never taught that spiritual practice should replace qualified medical care. He consistently affirmed the value of working with healthcare professionals while simultaneously engaging the deeper work of consciousness. What he offered was not a competing system, but a complementary dimension. The recognition that whatever medical treatment is being received, the inner work of releasing the fear consciousness surrounding illness is both legitimate and genuinely supportive of healing. The practical application is this. When facing a health challenge, you engage every appropriate form of professional care available to you. And simultaneously, in your inner practice, you work with Goldsmith's principles, releasing the fearful ownership of the condition through impersonalization, dissolving its apparent ultimacy through nothingization, and resting in the recognition of the divine wholeness that underlies every physical appearance. These two tracks are not in conflict. They address different dimensions of the same experience. What most people discover over weeks and months of this dual approach is that the inner work does not interfere with medical treatment. Instead, it changes the quality of the experience of being ill, dissolving the spiritual suffering that often accompanies physical suffering, even when the physical condition itself is still being addressed by other means. The advanced integration of these principles extends naturally into the domain of human relationships, an area where, for most people, the gap between spiritual understanding and actual behavior tends to be most embarrassingly visible. You can maintain a quality of inner recognition during solitary morning practice with reasonable consistency. But then a specific person in your life says a specific thing in a specific tone of voice, and every carefully cultivated inner equanimity appears to dissolve instantly, replaced by the familiar contraction of hurt, irritation, or quiet rage. Goldsmith did not regard this gap as evidence of spiritual failure. He regarded it as the precise location where genuine advanced work becomes possible. Relationships, he taught, are the supreme classroom for the practice of impersonalization, because no other domain so reliably activates the personal, the reactive, and the defended in human consciousness. Every difficult person in your life is, from this perspective, a precisely calibrated instrument for revealing which aspects of consciousness have not yet been freed from the illusion of separation. The practice in relationship begins with the recognition that the behavior arising from another person is not ultimately personal, not a targeted attack on your worth or your well-being, but an expression of that person's own consciousness, operating from its own degree of awareness and its own unresolved patterns. This recognition does not require you to accept harmful behavior or remain in damaging situations. It simply changes the inner quality of your response, from reactive self-defense to something closer to compassionate witnessing. Over months of consistent practice, this shift in inner orientation begins to change the actual quality of difficult relationships in ways that often surprise practitioners. When you stop responding to unconscious behavior with your own unconscious counter-reaction, the dynamic that was maintaining the conflict begins to lose its fuel. The most advanced dimension of Goldsmith's teaching on daily integration involves what he called the development of spiritual discernment, the gradually cultivated ability to distinguish, in real time, between the voice of conditioned ego consciousness and the deeper movement of what he identified as Christ consciousness or divine intelligence expressing through the individual. This discernment is not a mystical gift reserved for a few exceptional souls. It is a practical capacity that develops reliably and progressively through consistent inner work. In practical terms, spiritual discernment means learning to pause before automatic responses, to create a brief but genuine space between stimulus and reaction in which a deeper quality of knowing can surface. Most of our suffering in daily life, Goldsmith observed, comes not from the circumstances themselves, but from the speed with which conditioned consciousness reacts to circumstances before any genuine discernment can occur. The reactive mind moves faster than wisdom. The practice is to slow the gap. This is cultivated through the same basic practices already described: the morning silence, the listening, the impersonalization, but now applied with increasing subtlety to the specific textures of ordinary daily interaction. You begin noticing the subtle tightening in consciousness that precedes a reactive response. You learn to recognize the quality of genuine inner guidance, which typically arrives not as an urgent voice, but as a quiet, settled knowing that does not depend on external validation. Building this discernment reliably takes time, often a year or more of dedicated practice in real-life conditions. But those who develop it describe something that no institutional religious training had ever offered them: the capacity to navigate the full complexity of daily life from a place of inner authority that is genuinely their own. There comes a moment in the practice of these principles, not a single dramatic instant, but a gradual dawning that accumulates over months until it cannot be ignored, when the entire framework of your spiritual life has fundamentally reorganized itself. The God you used to approach from outside is now recognized as the very ground you are standing on. The prayers you used to send upward into a distant heaven now arise as a kind of inner listening to a presence that was never absent. The church that seemed to hold the keys to your spiritual life is recognized, with compassion rather than bitterness, as an institution that was doing its best within a framework that was always too small for the reality it was trying to contain. This reorganization does not produce arrogance. If anything, it produces a quality of humility that is deeper and more stable than anything the old model of earned spiritual worthiness ever generated. Because now the wholeness you experience is not something you achieved, it is something you recognized. And the recognition carries with it the understanding that every human being, including those still sitting in the pews, still reciting the petitionary prayers, still waiting for a God who seems perpetually delayed, is carrying the same wholeness inside them, waiting for the same recognition to dawn. This is why Goldsmith never positioned himself as a founder of a new religion or a new institution. He understood, with precise clarity, that any attempt to institutionalize these insights would reproduce the very dynamic he was working to dissolve. The moment recognition becomes doctrine, the moment inner knowing becomes required belief, the transformation freezes into a new form of the old dependency. What he offered instead was simpler and more radical. The invitation to discover through direct inner experience what no institution could ever hand you, your own unmediated, living, already whole relationship with the divine reality that is your deepest nature. The transformation that these teachings produce in a person's relationship with the Bible and with Scripture in general is one of the most striking and often unexpected dimensions of genuine inner growth. For most people raised in traditional Christianity, Scripture is an authority text, a collection of divinely approved statements that must be believed correctly in order to secure spiritual standing. It is approached with a mixture of reverence and anxiety. Understanding it correctly feels urgent. Misunderstanding it feels dangerous. As consciousness shifts through Goldsmith's approach, Scripture begins to function differently. It stops being a rulebook and becomes what it always was at its deepest level, a record of human consciousness touching divine reality, expressed in the language and imagery of specific times and places, but pointing consistently toward the same timeless recognition. The parables of Jesus, read from this new vantage point, are not moral instructions. They are maps of consciousness, precise descriptions of how the inner movement from spiritual poverty to spiritual recognition actually unfolds. The prodigal son is no longer simply a story about forgiveness. It becomes a description of every human being who has wandered into the far country of felt separation from God, and in the depths of that separation, turned inward toward the recognition that the Father's house, the wholeness of divine presence, was never actually left behind. The return is not a journey across distance. It is an awakening from the dream of distance. Reading Scripture from this place produces a quality of nourishment that years of institutional Bible study rarely generated. The words begin to resonate with the living quality of direct experience rather than with the distant authority of approved doctrine. They confirm what you are already discovering in the silence. There is a question that every sincere practitioner of these principles eventually brings to the surface, sometimes openly, sometimes only in the most private hours of inner life. The question is, what do I do with the community I am leaving behind? Not necessarily leaving physically, but leaving in the sense that my inner life has moved to a place that the institutional framework can no longer fully contain. The people I have worshipped with for years, the traditions that shaped my earliest sense of the sacred, the language and ritual that once felt like home. How do I hold all of that as I move into this new inner space? Goldsmith's response to this question was among his most pastorally sensitive teachings. He did not advocate for dramatic departures or public declarations of transcendence. He understood that spiritual community, even within its limitations, serves genuine human needs, the need for shared ritual, for mutual support in difficulty, for the companionship of people who take the inner life seriously. These are real needs, and dismissing them in the name of advanced spirituality is its own form of spiritual immaturity. What he encouraged instead was a kind of gentle dual citizenship, remaining present and engaged in whatever community genuinely nourished some authentic dimension of the inner life, while no longer expecting that community to provide what it was never designed to provide. You attend the service without needing the service to be something it is not. You participate in the communal prayer while holding, inwardly, the recognition that no intermediary is actually required. You receive the fellowship and give the fellowship, fully and warmly, while resting in the knowledge that your deepest spiritual nourishment now comes from a source that no institution controls. This is not spiritual arrogance. It is spiritual maturity, the capacity to receive partial nourishment with genuine gratitude while no longer starving yourself by pretending that partial nourishment is the whole meal. You arrived at this teaching carrying something that most people carry for an entire lifetime without ever fully naming it, a quiet, persistent ache that sits just beneath the surface of religious devotion, the wordless sense that despite all the sincerity, all the attendance, all the prayer, something essential was still missing. You were not wrong. Something was missing, not from God, not from you, from the framework you were given for relating to both. Joel Goldsmith spent his life pointing toward the reality that lies on the other side of that framework. Not a new religion, not a new set of required beliefs, but a direct, living, unmediated recognition of the divine wholeness that is the actual ground of your existence. This recognition does not arrive as a single dramatic lightning bolt. It comes as a gradual dawning, confirmed over weeks and months of sincere inner practice, that the presence you were searching for was never absent, and the strength you were waiting to receive was never withheld. The church kept you weak not out of cruelty, but out of its own unexamined limitation, the inherited assumption that humanity is fundamentally separated from God and requires institutional mediation to bridge the gap. That assumption was always untrue, and now you know it. Not as a theological position adopted from the outside, but as an inner recognition beginning to take root in the deepest soil of your consciousness. What you do with this recognition is entirely yours. No institution will manage it for you. No teacher will maintain it on your behalf. It lives in the quality of your daily inner practice, in the sincerity of your listening, in the consistency of your return to the silence where the still, small voice speaks without words to a consciousness finally willing to hear. If this understanding has opened something real and lasting in you, like this video to carry these teachings further, subscribe for more transformative Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment below, "I am whole," to confirm that you have heard what was always true about you.